Hey, it's Meg Major with Winsight Grocery Business. Welcome to Grocery COVID Live. We've got a special edition today, and joining us for our segment is our senior editor, Jen Straley, our content manager, KATMARTIN, and Anne-Marie Roerink of 210 Analytics, who will join us to discuss the crazy meat purchase patterns that we've seen in the past couple of months. Phil, I'll turn it over to you to make a couple of intro comments before we bring Anne-Marie in for some more in-depth convo.
Sure. Anne-Marie, welcome to our little group here on COVID-19. Glad to have you here. Also, just a reminder, please use Facebook to send in any comments, questions that you might have for Anne-Marie or any of us. But wow, what a week. You know, John Tyson takes out these full-page ads and says in them, the food supply is breaking. So New York Times, Washington Post, and Arkansas Democrat Gazette, we saw that. We started out the week being very nervous. We started seeing out the week where shoppers were running to start to hoard meat. Then on Tuesday night, our president declared that meat plants must stay open to keep the food supply going. A lot of pushback there. And just to give you some idea, one of the reasons for the pushback, if we take a look just in Wisconsin, we've seen in Darien, Wisconsin, 104 COVID cases at Birdseye, in Green Bay, 260 at JBS, 170 at American Food Group, Village of Denmark, 35 cases at Salm Partners, Cudahy, 28, 597 cases just in Wisconsin from meat packing plants, and that's 9% of the total number in the state. The number is likely higher because not all food plants are saying how many of their workers have tested positive. Then we go to the other part of the country on the East Coast. In Maine, we actually see for the first time cases in Maine. 8 employees of Tyson have tested positive. State health officials said Tyson is making significant strides to implement all their public health recommendations. It just goes on and on throughout the country, regardless of what the president has said. And these CEOs of these meat packing plants don't want to put their workers at risk, don't want to put their families at risk. A lot of the workers aren't showing up for work. And in fact, this morning we had a governor that said, hey, if you work in a meat packing plant and you don't show up for work, we're not going to give you unemployment. So we've gotten into this huge battle of money versus life. And it's a serious situation, which is why, Anne-Marie, I'm so glad that you're with us. We can see what some of the facts are and then also get some of your opinions of what's going to happen. So Meg, why don't you get us started?
Sure enough, Phil, thank you. So I think before we kind of get into the more nuanced conversations about what you just discussed, I'd like to take a step back because it's so significant, as we talked earlier in my intro, about how meat sales has really skyrocketed during the pandemic buying. Meat has played a starring role for a number of reasons, but primarily because families have had to buy food for 3 day parts. The dramatic gains in meat sales really took hold in the inflection point, which is referred to as March 1. So I'd like to turn to Anne-Marie quickly and ask Anne-Marie if you could kind of set it up to discuss how rising meat sales mirrored consumer anxiety levels in the past few weeks, what proteins trended strongest, and maybe what were the biggest surprises learned from the panic buying in the meat department. So Anne-Marie, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Good to see you, Meg, Phil, crew. So yes, it's been a wild couple of weeks here. And just to back up a little bit, pre-coronavirus, we saw a lot of media coverage on maybe America falling out of meat. We knew in reality that wasn't the case. We know the vast majority of people, 80-something%, still called themselves meat eaters. We knew that meat across the store is about 90 billion in size, whereas meat alternatives are less than 1 billion. But there was a lot of talk about what kind of role is meat playing in today's meal lineup. Well, then coronavirus happened. And as you said, if you look at March 1, everything was still the way it was in 2019, early 2020. Then March 8 rolled around, and that's really where non-edibles started to gear up. So anything from what Phil talked about, the hand sanitizers, the cleaners, everything that people felt would help them from not getting the virus. Then March 8th onwards is really when food sales started to gear up, and meat was really the star of the perimeter. And the two big panic buying weeks were March 15, the week endings of March 15 and March 22nd, where at some point meat nearly doubled over the same week in the last year. Now, if you look at it at the individual protein level, beef has done tremendously well. Beef actually gained in terms of the absolute dollar share and the absolute volume share. But of course, because beef is so big, they don't necessarily have the highest growth percentages. And we saw enormous consumer demand starting to pop up for what I would call the secondary protein. So anything like turkey and lamb that typically have a much lower household penetration. And then we just saw enormous strength for things like ground, and it was ground beef, ground lamb, ground pork. They were all up tremendously. Hot dogs are completely back. I don't know if anybody here on the line today is part of the hot dog crowd, but boy, are they back.
Yes,
So,
and I don't even really like hot dogs, but yes, I'm buying them.
So, Anne-Marie, let me ask you a question. Understanding everything that you just said, we also had Easter happening earlier this year. And looking at the Nielsen data, spiral hams, for example, I think 3 weeks in a row were at the top as a percentage increase, about 400% more than normal. Was it just because of Easter? Because I didn't hear of a lot of people who were having, big family gatherings around Easter, or was it that, people are just trying other meats?
People are absolutely trying different meats. Initially, of course, everybody started to buy beef and chicken. Then we all have seen the pictures or experienced the empty meat cases. And what was interesting is that's when we saw people start to switch to some of those smaller ones like lamb and exotic meat. Bison, for instance, just had a field day those couple of weeks and still are. And I think all those have longer term ramifications, because now somebody has bought lamb for the first time in their lives, bison for the first time in their lives. There are endless searches in recipe websites, and Pinterest is seeing big spikes in people looking for, how do I freeze meat? How do I prepare lamb? And so we're seeing a huge interest in different kinds of proteins. And I think both from the perspective of what was available, but also, hey, we now have time to cook. We have a little bit more time to experiment with things. So I think it's a combination of the both. And it's been a very interesting ride over the last couple of weeks, just to see all sorts of proteins move well beyond prior year levels. Easter absolutely had something to do with that. Like, for instance, lamb Easter week shot up 108%. We all know that is directly related to Easter. And then the week right after it shot back down. So there were Easter patterns, just different than we have seen in prior years.
Hey, Anne-Marie, would you agree that some of that, even though, like maintaining traditions during holidays is so important? So with all the restaurants closed, that's not a huge surprise, because most people do enjoy those kind of proteins on high holidays like that. But, everybody's making their own celebrations to maintain those traditions. So I think that's probably a bit of that as well.
I would agree. I think the last couple of weeks have seen a lot of return to the familiar, and that's part of the success of meat these last couple of weeks. People are just making pot pies and meatloaves and just really recipes that they perhaps normally don't have time for, or just it's a little bit of a bright point in a difficult time. So I think
or typically go out to eat those meals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's been the impact on plant-based proteins, Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat? When I walked into the supermarket, and I'm trying to visit between 3 and 5 supermarkets every week to see what's going on. And probably about 3 weeks ago, the frozen food case was decimated. It was absolutely empty, except for Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, corn, all these plant-based alternatives to meat. They were still there.
Yeah, that's a pattern we've seen really throughout the last couple of weeks, where pictures started streaming in of completely empty meat cases with still fully stocked meat alternatives. So I do believe they have seen a spike in sales as well, but this is where the good old statistics come in. As a data geek, the household penetration for meat alternatives is 14%, whereas virtually all households buy meat. And so, when there's a run on meat and it clears out the entire meat case, there's still only 14% who have bought meat alternatives. Now, that might have gone up a little bit because people said, well, it's the only thing that's there. I can try that and see how I like it. But I do believe coming out of this, retailers are going to take some time to see what moved, what didn't move, where might we be overstocked. And I think there's going to be some right sizing happening in many areas.
So Jen and Kat, back to the hot dog index. Kat, you said you don't like hot dogs, but you're buying them. What are you both seeing in the stores as it relates to meat versus alternative meat proteins?
Yeah, I saw the same thing. I think, we talked about this in our last segment, but I had the same experience that you did. When this all started and the meat section was cleared, the only thing that remained were the plant-based alternatives. I haven't seen, I've yet to see the impact in store of, the meat processing facilities closing. My experience shopping as recently as Monday at Costco was that, the meat section was fully stocked. So I don't know, maybe Anne Marie can speak to, when are we going to see this, the panic buying again and the empty meat cases?
Anne Marie?
Yeah, so there's typically a back order, in the cold storage. So, that's what stores are using right now. So the shortages probably will only start to be felt maybe this week onwards, as about 25% of pork and beef capacity is offline. Only about 10% of poultry capacity is offline at this point. But what I do point out is I think shortage is a very perhaps poorly chosen word, because I think it does remind shoppers of divisions of those panic buying weeks when the meat case was completely empty. So it's more of a tightness. It's more of you might go to the store to buy ribs and come home with roast kind of thing. Shoppers are starting to see some of those prices starting to come up. There's definitely fewer items in store. That's something we looked at during the webinar yesterday. So this past week, there were about 60 fewer different SKUs in store. So that's the kind of thing we're going to see, less variety.
But also we're starting to see some retailers, Safeway, for example, in California, is starting to limit the amount of meat that people can buy.
Yeah.
Even if they're taking that out of cold storage, even if they've got enough supply, they want to prevent what happened with toilet paper. Matter of fact, having empty shelves. So
Yep.
Do you think that retailers throughout the country are going to start limiting it to 2 pounds, 4 pounds, 2 packages, whatever that is?
Many have ever since the start of the pandemic, ever since those weeks of March 15 and 22. Now, it depended on the type of cut. Ground beef, for instance, has been in hot demand and limited supply for many weeks. So many retailers have had signs up to say only 1 or 2 packages or a certain amount. Chicken for a while was that way. I think we're going to see that continue. I see a lot of shopper feedback come in as well through the retail feedback group. And a lot of them actually comment on the fact that when retailers put out their stock all throughout the day so that everybody has a chance to buy a little bit of meat and poultry, that is highly appreciated by the shopper. So this whole stack them high, let them fly, as the meat world likes to do, is just not something that I think is working in the current environment. Just kind of, if you have limited stock, make sure you put it out throughout the day, and make sure that you put purchase limits on it. I think most shoppers actually appreciate that rather than are being annoyed by it.
And Anne Marie, I noticed too on Social Chatter that most consumers notice it too. So
Yeah.
that when it's spread out through the course of the day, instead of just all set in the morning at a designated hour, because I've picked up on a lot of that customers are really thanking retailers for spreading that supply out. I have a quick question for you, and it's kind of obvious and leading, but just the same, do you think that the food service marketplace and the closures of restaurants, et cetera, has mitigated at least somewhat the tightening in the retail space of the meat supply?
Mm. That would be the logical thing. The issue is that a lot of the processors are one or the other. So they either supply retail or they supply food service. So let's talk bacon for a minute. 75% of total bacon goes into food service. The way they sell that is the size of a cookie sheet, if you will. Challenge accepted. As far as I'm concerned, I love bacon, but there aren't a whole lot of shoppers that can buy a cookie sheet amount worth of bacon. And the processors that go into food service don't have the equipment, they don't have the packaging to repackage that very easily to put it into retail. Now, the USDA has come out and eased the way that a lot of the labeling can be done, and so it's a little bit easier, all in the hopes of helping some of that produce and meat, etc., supply to make it into retail a little bit more. But it continues to be a little bit of a challenge.
But that for me is something that really has me concerned. We're hearing about bakeries who have 50-pound bags of flour and they're repackaging it in baggies or other things for people. Aren't we, especially when it comes to meat, especially when it comes to bacon, aren't we really, pushing the limit a little bit on food safety? And are we going to wind up with another major situation as all these food service people, to your point, who are not equipped for retail packaging, start repackaging it into smaller sizes without the right equipment, without the right knowledge, without a food safety inspector there? So are we going to have even a bigger problem?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, go ahead, Emery.
Yeah, it's a great point. But I will say in the current environment, I think shoppers and producers alike are just hyper focused on food safety, on cleanliness, on the notion of wearing masks in store, having the plexiglass also in the full service meat case. So I think the reason why we haven't seen so much of the food service supply come into retail is because of just making sure that there is food safety as the very first priority, right along with protecting the employees. So I agree that just has to remain front and center instead of just trying to push demand from one area into the next.
So look into your crystal ball. What happens when we get past COVID-19? What happens when we get past having the meat plants closures and they're all reopened? We get back to normal supplies. What does 6, 9, 12 months from now look like for meat?
I think, first of all, the answer is going to be very regional. If you just look at some of the biggest states, how different they are. New York, one of the hardest hit ones. Texas already opening back up. California, very cautious. And so I think it's going to be very difficult to have just one number slapped on there for the entire nation. And so my whole point is look at where you were as a start, and then kind of look at it as an up and down arrows, if you will. How hard was your state hit financially, and what kind of economic crisis are people in? How much pressure is there? How much were people personally affected, which affects kind of the social mindset of, do I want to go back into restaurants? Meg, you mentioned it. There's now 3 meals every day, plus snacks that people are sourcing themselves. I think specific to meat, so many people have bought cuts and kinds that they never bought before. People are experimenting. They're searching for recipes. More than anything, they bought all sorts of appliances. Profitero looked at what moved on Amazon and saw huge surges in anything from instant pasta, air fryers, to grills, to
bread baking
coffee machines, bread makers, huge one. People are learning how to make their own artisan bread. People are learning how to cook their own ribs. And those are skills that I think the longer this takes, the more habits will go from temporary to longer term. Now, as the pressure of life comes back and we're all starting to scram for time again, some of those will obviously start to give away to convenience, but the skills, which was sorely lacking in the meat space, those skills will have highly elevated during Corona.
Anne Marie, one thing that I recalled too that I found fascinating in one of your very first installments that we have been covering, your rolling reports with IRI data, was how the one consumer intercept that you did, the consumer said, I've never really even known how to open a package of meat, cook a package of meat, but I guess I'm going to learn. So I think that that's really brought a lot of people that especially with meat and millennials, there was always that statistic that they don't like to handle raw meat. They just want to rip a package open, throw it. But, but most of the time, I just thought that was fascinating. And from my perspective, when you talked about the equipment and kitchen things that folks were buying during the past couple of months, I only just remembered thinking, I haven't used this thing in 5 years.
Let me go to Facebook, Jen. Before I let you chime in, let me just go to Facebook and let's take a question. Our friend Kai Robertson is back. I'd be interested in hearing about what others are seeing with respect to increased purchases of grains, which is a good substitute for animal-based sources of protein and other nutrients. This may quicken the shift of consumers trending to more plant-forward, lower impact diets, not eliminating meat, but rather eating smaller amounts of animal-based product or lower GHG impact meat options. Anne Marie, what do you think?
So over the last couple of years, we had been seeing a little bit of a trend toward flexitarians, which I think Kai is describing there. The number of vegans, vegetarians has been extremely stable for the last 15 years that I've been studying meat. And it's always been right around 5%. Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 4, but it's always right around 5. What has been changing are the number of people that claim they are flexitarian. So they still eat meat, they just don't eat it as often, they eat smaller amounts. And in part of that, they are looking for other sources of protein. So what we did see during the big panic weeks was things like dried beans, etc., flying off the shelves as well. And in fact, the lady, Meg, that you referenced, I kind of peeked in her card and she goes, yeah, I bought dried beans too. I have not a clue what to do with them, but my mom told me to get them. So because they're a good protein backup. So again, I think experimentation is fascinating right now and it's going to change patterns going forward. Phil, you mentioned frozen food earlier. Frozen is off the charts, continues to be off the chart. And a lot of that has to do with people wanting to limit their number of trips to the store, people wanting to having a backup supply 2-3 weeks worth. And so, all those are all people that are now figuring out new brands, new products. They have a whole freezer full of items that they may not have before. And so experimentation is, in my mind, what is going to change grocery retailing for a long time to come.
And Jen, sorry to interrupt you. What were you going to add?
Oh, I was just, relating to Meg's saying, I got an Instapot, pulling out the crock pot, using things that, just this 3 meals a day. And I have 2 kids and it's like, I'm, running a bed and breakfast here,
Or is it just, and let me ask everybody around the table here, is it just 3 meals a day? Or what I'm observing among my neighbors, they look to be eating constantly. I mean, from the time that they wake up, and I'm not saying 3 meals a day and snacks in between. It's just like stuffing their faces the whole time because they're bored, they're sitting at their desk. So, they might be on Zoom or whatever else, but right over there is that hot dog that Meg was talking about.
Yeah, I typically take a walk around 2 or 3 in the afternoons, weather permitting. It's been raining here in Chicago for the last few days, but it always shocks me as I'm walking through my neighborhood how much grilling I'm smelling going on. And I'm like, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, like, why are you grilling now? But I mean, I think it's just all of our schedules are so completely off that, grilling on a Tuesday at 2 is now normal. So.
And Jen, what are you seeing in Denver?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just among my social group, I mean, everyone's doing a lot of cooking, and as Anne Marie was saying, you know, there's a lot of new trial going on. And to Meg's point, you know, about restaurants, I mean, there's takeout, but you know, we're not really going to restaurants with the frequency that we once were. So people are craving those kind of, you know, what you would go out to eat. And so like, why don't I try to make that at home? And so like last night I made chicken lettuce wraps, which I've never made before, but they, you know, family approved. They're going on the repertoire.
So the kids like them.
Yeah.
So again, Anne Marie, before we leave, and we've got to wrap up in just about 2 or 3 minutes, what advice do you have for retailers, for meat manufacturers, as it relates to all this anxiety that's being built up about meat shortages, all these plants that are closing, the workers who have said, hey, I'm not showing up for work. I don't care if I get another $2 an hour. It's just not worth it. What advice would you give them all?
I think we have talked about a few of them. The whole idea of spread out the inventory you have, communicate. So what I'm seeing, for instance, in dairy is that our consumers are saying, and here I'm reading all these consumer reports about farmers dumping milk, and yet I'm only allowed to buy 2 gallons of milk. So consumers read things, then they are in the store and they're dealing with a completely different reality. So as hard as it is, because so much of our energy right now is going into operations, as hard as it is we have to continue to communicate. We have to make sure that everybody has a chance to engage with whatever inventory we do have. If there is another stampede on meat, empower one of your associates in the meat department to kind of regulate the area, make sure people remain that 6-foot distance. If you still have your food, your full service counter open, you know, right now consumers are so focused on the idea of germs and getting sick from each other. So we're seeing some of those food service or the full service counters actually have the plexiglass screens, much like you see at checkout. We see people wearing masks. So whether or not you feel that is the right thing or the wrong thing to do, it is what consumers want to see. They want to see what you as a store or what we as brands are doing in order to keep people safe. And being very visible about that is just extremely important right now.
So on that note, I want to go back to Facebook. Joan says, we need a system that connects farmers with food banks and other users of meat, dairy, and produce. My cousins own and operate a dairy farm in Wisconsin. Earlier this week, she posted about a pork farmer in the area that was looking for help in selling their hogs. My cousin said she felt guilty getting over 200 pounds of pork for $100, though they did need to break it down themselves. I told her that I'm sure the pork farmer was happy to get the money and that she was spreading the word. We must do better than this. So I guess, you know, that's probably our last word. We must do better than this, whether it's meat, whether it's beans, whether it's anything that's sold in the supermarket. So Anne Marie, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. You're always welcome to join us. You've got great insights always for the 20 years that I know you and have worked with you. So thanks for doing it. For all of our viewers, again, thank you. We'll be back Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, 9:30 a.m. Pacific, and on Thursday as well at the same time. Continue to add your comments on Facebook. We will monitor them and we'll bring them back. And with that, be safe.